Welcome to the presentation on talent identification, a Solomon Islands perspective, focused on a literature review of talent identification, presented by AAlsop. A brief summary of the context of the Solomon Islands is that they're a Pacific country who are hosting the next 2023 Pacific Games. This is a significant event which has brought investment from the government and donor agencies with focus around talent identification. This has also led to sport policy being reviewed and updated, which the literature review identified that the SPLIS model, sport policy leading to international sport success, validated that it is an important pillar of sustained success which countries need to invest into. So about the program, it's an emerging talent ID program in collaboration with the national federations. The literature review found that this is an important step in talent identification and talent detection to collaborate with national federations. Specifically, the program is focused in the Solomon Islands across 28 different sports, as that's leading to the 2023 Pacific Games. And some of the objectives which were supported through the literature review is that obvious outcome is that they're looking at athletes that are being potentials for representing Solomons in the next 3 to 8 years, but there is an exposure and awareness aspect of the talent ID program through the community, with an emphasis around educating and engaging at different levels of the community. The literature review identified commonalities in target groups, so who's involved in talent identification programs. In this case, the Solomon Islands program is focused on male and female athletes of an age group of 14 to 23 years across 3 predominant cohorts of high school, tertiary and community. There is also a focus there on parasport athletes and potential international prospects, so Solomon Island athletes that have heritage or passport eligibility that live overseas. Importantly, the literature also supported a holistic approach, multidisciplinary staff members involved in the talent identification process to ensure that it's more robust. Elements in the literature review also identified that the use of current athletes and coaches at the elite level that can be brought into talent identification at an emerging stage of development is important, and an aspect that supports the way in which there is success in the way talent identification is delivered. Where the program is being delivered, specifically within Honiara, the capital, where the Solomon Islands Sport and Leadership Institute operates. There's also been some provincial areas which are identified. The literature had shown that there is support for identification of what's determined as hotspots throughout different countries, where specific sporting talent comes from different regions within countries, potentially linked to specific sport. There's also some evidence there that supported the reasoning behind why some of the specific events and linkages that are happening within the community programs that enable sustainable success within talent ID programs, but it's something of more, it's a better return on investment, but also a controlled environment. When those programs are being delivered, specifically taking into consideration that the nature of the cohorts have academic requirements, but there's also opportunity to connect with the community group, which links with the evidence that shows the number of youth athletes between the age of 14 and 23 that are not engaged in school activities. How the program is actually engaging and coordinated with a range of different stakeholders is quite important. The evidence in the literature review had shown that it was very important to collaborate across different stakeholders from an ecological model perspective at each level. Specifically at the talent identification stage, where the program is split into two focus groups. Group of athletes will undertake an education session, which starts to get involved more of the criteria of looking at the character evaluation of the person and aspects of their mental skills, while the other group would be looking at the normal physical testing that we see, anthropometric power, speed, some muscular endurance and endurance, taking into consideration that it's a general sport approach, not a sport specific approach. This is also then balanced with what is seen in the literature as an elite athlete providing life story, which is an example of role modeling to potential athletes that are emerging through the system. What we see in the next stage is sort of the verification stage of the talent ID process, which looks for an element of commitment. This is a factor that we've seen consistency in the literature, which identifies there are athletes that potentially had shown some physiological markers, but as a long-term predictor to success, there were other factors such as the observation of character, commitment, coachability, their contribution to the program, and connection to sport. The non-shortlisted athletes are engaged then in a program which will be explained on the next slide. And this then moves into the formulation and specialization stage, which goes into talent development. Within the literature review, we identified some commonalities across the way that there is a process or an approach with talent identification programs. Very clearly, a lot of evidence identified a clarity of process which connected the initial stages to the longer term process. This helped with the engagement of athletes involved in the process, and it connected talent identification to development, which also then led to selection through to the performance stages. What we found through the literature review as well was that there was some evidence that showed the value of a holistic ecological approach, which identified through talent identification, there's a process, there's a person involved in that process, the context and the timing of those elements. So as we can see here, the initial phase that leads to an athlete development model, and then the further phase of talent selection, which goes into an athlete performance model. Importantly, in the context of the Solomon Islands, the initial stage of approaching and engaging athletes in the talent identification stage, T1, is identifying people who are involved in some type of physical literacy program. What we can see is that this then leads to the verification stage where there is a clear process of moving through that model, which then has been supported through different elements of the literature review, which showed factors that go beyond typical elements of criteria around physiological aspects. One of the other key elements which was very important is we identified non-shortlisted athletes within the talent identification stage. The early predictors of success, the literature supported evidence to promote them back into the generalization stage, which was around physical literacy, physical education, non-specialized training, where there's opportunities to still engage, have fun, but there's also future opportunities in sport. Another key element of the literature review found evidence to support the way in which the Solomon Islands had created their own framework for pathways, which was supported by the development model of sport participation seen here on the left, which ensures that there's more of a larger sample size of athletes that can be fed into the different elements of the pathway. This essentially avoids the typical linear approach that we see within Talent ID, and it allows multiple entry or re-entry points of transition for athletes. Very important in the context of the Solomon Islands. Undertaking a literature review for Pacific Island talent identification was quite limited But what there was evidence of is some very sport-specific criteria, which was important across the 28 sports that the Solomon Islands are targeting. Importantly, there is a need to identify better evidence-based approaches to look at evaluating the character, coachability, and growth mindset of athletes, which were proven to be future success factors. There's also further importance on understanding the specific nature of identifying the mental, cognitive, and psycho-behavioral skills of athletes, with the mindset of athletes understanding their potential for future development. The other evidence that was quite predominant through the literature review, the commonalities across other developing nations, was the external environment factors, the importance of the family life and situation that the young athlete is involved in, the whole person well-being, and also balancing the elements of dual career, which is important for later life development of the athlete that potentially isn't identified in their teenage years. But in this case, with the Solomon Islands, they're still looking at athletes into their early 20s, which is quite relevant to the situation. As outlined here in the reference list, there's a number of articles that give evidence to a number of the key principles that were looked at from a literature review perspective of talent identification around the holistic ecological model, the development model of sport participation, understanding the chance factors involved in sport, particularly talent identification, and understanding the nature and nurture debate that is commonly seen and supported now through relevant and up-to-date talent identification